Welcome to another Dawn podcast, and this afternoon we've got Van Lay, the same surname as mine actually, but we're not related. And I came across Van after reading a story, I think it was in the AFR, or one of the mainstream newspapers, about digital banking. And I was fascinated that in the space of diversity and inclusion, I'm constantly looking out for people of diverse backgrounds in amazing roles or startup roles or in some of the leadership roles. And I thought I need to reach out to Van. And we met and connected, and we talk about lots of things. And it was so great that she's agreed to come along to share about your story, your journey into the tech startup world and where you're from. How did you get into the tech startup world? You're a co-founder of Xinja?
So I became a co-founder of Xinja almost 2 years ago now. And as with many things in life, these conversations start with people that you meet at different times in your career that you stay in touch with. And it was this one of my usual catch-ups with people I've worked with that I enjoy working with, who share similar ideals around how industries and organisations should be. And it happened to be this particular time, it was a catch-up with Eric Wilson, who's the founder of Xinja. And we were having one of those, so what have you been up to lately? And I talked about what I was doing, and then I asked him what he was up to, and he said, I'm thinking of starting a bank. And I remember thinking, why on earth would anyone want to do that? And that's exactly what this country needs, yet another bank, like every other bank that's out there. What are you going to do that's going to be any different? What problems are you going to solve any better than anyone else out there? Why does this country need another bank? And so the conversation kind of started from there. And what's interesting is that I never set out to be a banker. Having said that, I started my career working with the banking regulator, and it's been a bit of a full circle for me to come back now, almost 15 years later, to now be back in the industry again, or at least looking at entering the industry again.
So what did you start it out as? What was? Tell me a bit about Van. Obviously, with the name of Lay, you're a Vietnamese background. Tell me a bit about that.
Sure. So both my parents are Vietnamese. My father was from the north. My mother is from the south. We left Vietnam as refugees around 1980. I was maybe about 4 months old at the time when my parents left. And by the time we arrived in Australia, I was about 11 months. We settled in Perth, and I lived and grew up in Perth for most of my life until I finished my law degree there, and then took on a graduate role at APRA very soon afterwards, and that's what led to the start of my career and a relocation to Sydney.
And so, do you remember did your parents tell you which camp they were in?
As far as I can remember, it was a camp in Indonesia where we were processed offshore.
Right.
And I think we were there for about 3 months before settling in Perth. And at that time, it was just myself, my mum and my dad. All my brothers and sisters were born in Australia. And even the three of us arriving in Australia was never meant to happen. The plan was meant to be that my father would leave the country first. My parents had recently been married, so they'd been married, I don't know, maybe a year or so, just got married, just became parents, 3-4-month-old baby, and the father decides he's going to disappear, and who knows whether it be days, weeks, months or years before my mother would know whether he was still alive, where he was, how he'd find some way to contact us to let us know we were okay. And I remember what it was like for me when I was a parent for the first time, and what it was like being a mother with a 3 or 4 month old. And if I look back to what it must have been like for my mother, she was about 25 at the time, 25 or 26. and how terrifying it must be, the idea of potentially taking the risk that you might end up a single parent for the rest of your life. So my father was meant to go first, and it was at the very last minute on the night that he was meant to leave that my mother decided that she wasn't going to wait around and wonder what was going to happen, and she found a way to get to the spot where they were meant to be meeting everyone who was going to be on this boat. And this was a boat that was already packed, and I'm pretty sure back in those days there wasn't anyone who was a designated OH&S officer to say you've got too many people and you're now risking lives if you take on anyone else.
I remember those boat journeys, and I can tell you there's none of that. There was none of that.
And from what I was told, back in those days, if the Coast Guards heard a single thing, you'd get shot on sight. So here's my 25, 26-year-old mother with a 4-month-old baby, nothing in tow, begging the captain of this boat to take on 2 extra passengers. So there's my mother trying to convince the captain of this boat to accept the risk to the lives of everyone else on this boat, taking on 2 extra passengers, one of whose volume you had very limited control over. How do you stop a 4-month-old baby from, crying at the most inopportune times? But my mother can be very convincing. Yeah. So somehow she managed to convince him to take all 3 of us on board. And of course, the boat was not prepared to have children on board, let alone an infant.
Baby, 4-month-old baby.
Yeah. And, when I think about what it must have been like for my parents in that situation, there were, maybe 3 possible scenarios. One was that none of us could survive and we'd all die on the trip. Die of starvation or being killed by pirates or storms, illness, any of those things could arise. Or one of us could survive and the other 2 would be lost, which would be just as heartbreaking. Or 2 of us survive and 1 was lost, just as heartbreaking. The least possible scenario, or the least probable scenario, was that all 3 of us would survive. And somehow that happened, and I think that's that whole journey and the improbability of success, along with many other things that have happened in our lifetime since, are a huge factor behind the faith that my parents have.
And what was, do you recall, you grew up in Perth. I know that Perth was one of the states in Australia that during the arrival of Vietnamese refugees, there were many that went to Perth.
Yeah.
Majority went to...
That's right. My family were one of the first few arrivals back then. Yeah.
Do you recall what was it like growing up in Perth?
It was very awkward. It was
Did you fit in?
Very awkward. I remember... I still remember being in preschool, and for some reason, of all the incidents I remember about preschool, I remember this fruit bowl going around, and this one particular time there was a new vegetable in there. It was celery, and all the other kids just got straight into it, and they were loving it. And all I remember is just that, the sound of the crunch as they bit into the celery. And I thought, what is this thing? I've never tried it before. Everyone else seems to be loving it. So I took a bite, scrunched up my face, thought, what the hell is this rubbish? I did not get this at all. And went back to apples or something sweeter that I was aware of. And it was probably one of my first experiences of, there's something a little bit different here. Everyone else is able to enjoy what's there, and except for me. So
did you, were you raised as a Vietnamese daughter, or an Asian daughter, and at home you'd have to, adhere to certain...
Vietnamese food the whole way. The only place that I was exposed to Western food, if you like, was at school, which is why the celery was so fascinating to me. Fruit, at least, is cross-cultural. But, things like, celery, it seems like such a basic little thing. But it was probably my first exposure to, there's something different here. And I don't think I'd ever been aware that I was having a different experience of growing up until, that very first moment. And then in primary school, when we came across things like school camps, and, there'd be dishes like, spaghetti and even things like toast and other things. I grew up dipping toast in coffee for breakfast, and there were all these other things to eat, and they all required knives and forks. And I remember sitting there thinking, where are the chopsticks? Or can I just use my hands? No one else is doing this. I'm not sure what to do here. And I still remember being the last one to finish my meal because I was still working out how to use a knife and fork. And I remember thinking, God, it would just so much easier if I could just use my fingers. So they're like little experiences like that where I start to notice differences. And what was interesting is it wasn't just cultural, it was also socioeconomic, because we started on nothing. We were largely dependent on donations from charities, the church. There was some degree of government benefits to get us on our feet. So things like having a TV didn't exist for a long, long time. So when you go to school and kids are talking about this TV show or that TV show, I had no idea what they were talking about. But kids were talking about Barbie dolls. Again, I had no idea what they were talking about. It was strange. The only common experiences that I had with a lot of my childhood friends were the games that we played in the playground, or chores that we do at home. But all of those other experiences, places you'd go on holidays and things like that, they weren't really shared experiences for quite a long time. And back in those days in Perth as well, it wasn't uncommon to be walking to school and have someone drive by and say something like, ching chongs, go home, or something like that. And it's, the first time you hear it as a child, your immediate reaction is, what's wrong with me? What have I done? Am I in trouble? Why would someone say that? And what's a ching chong? And no one could tell me. My parents had no idea.
So you didn't. So although kind of discrimination, those prejudices were kind of thrown at you, you didn't understand that it was prejudice in the first place. Would that be right to say?
Yeah.
And then you just kind of
so young. It was just like, there's this other thing I'm supposed to be now called a ching chong, and I don't know what it is. I better work that out and learn how to be good at that. So it was. Yeah, it took a while before, I think after a few of these, I think in the sentiment and the tone, I started to understand that it wasn't necessarily flattery. And then there were, other interesting experiences where, something would happen, like I'd be left out of a team at sport, or I'd be part of a group of kids who had to stay behind at school to clean up or something. And then I started to keep wondering, is it because I'm different, or is it because I'm from another country? I know it wasn't because of my English, because my English was absolutely perfect, so it had to be something else. And I always found that...
and what did it make you? Did you think it caused you to kind of question or reflect about your identity? And did it make you feel any kind of... some people, when they experience those instances that you described, would come to a conclusion or a position whereby they feel that they've been discriminated against, and they will have some kind of angst and would be slightly angry about it. How did you...
I was so angry at my parents. It's like, why couldn't they have been white? My life would have been so much easier. I hated my skin. I hated my hair. I remember one of the happiest days at school was when I caught a glimpse of my hair in sunlight and it had a brown tinge to it. And I remember thinking, yay, I'm not completely Asian. There's a little part that looks maybe remotely Caucasian. And I was so jealous of the girls who had the fair hair and the fair skin, and, you know, whose parents were also part of the school community. My parents were always working, so they couldn't go to, parents and friends meetings. They couldn't help out in the canteen and things like that. So there's just so many points of difference. And for the longest time, the people I was angry at was my parents. You know, yeah, apparently that's how a child thinks. But just and just having to deal with all of these differences. And it's funny. One of my for some reason, I'm just remembering now. This time when my parents' friends came over, and they were just teasing me, and they said, "What's your nationality?" And I said, "I'm Australian." And they said, "No, you're not. You're Vietnamese." And I said, "Well, not really. Maybe I'm both." And they said, "But you can only pick one." And that just had me in a very confused state for the longest time. And they were just teasing. I can imagine. I was like, well, if I'm not really Australian, I'm not really Vietnamese, then who am I really? And one of the areas where this gulf kind of grew over time was so through school, I found I was just very good at paying attention, and so schoolwork was relatively easy for me. But I learned very quickly that just being good at school actually doesn't get you very far, especially in terms of learning to interact with other people and fitting in. And I had this constant sense of it didn't matter how good I was at school, it was never going to be enough. I was always going to feel like an outsider of some sort. And so in many ways, I always felt like I was on the outside of, I suppose, normal society as far as social engagements and interactions go. Even the idea of having a sleepover or going to a friend's place was the way that my parents dealt with it was so different to other parents. Like, for example, I remember going to a birthday party when I was 7, and the birthday present that my mother got for me to give to my friend was a packet of underwear. I was so popular after that. But, my parents wanted to be practical, and everyone else's parents, had bought toys and things to for them to bring to birthday parties. So, just little things like that. I remember just being so excited to go to that birthday party. I had no idea that underwear is not what you're supposed to bring. And this poor girl as well, she's there ripping the wrapping off the present, being all excited, thinking that was going to be a toy or something like that. And then there she is with, a packet of underwear going, oh, what do I do with this?
What did you do? How did she feel when she opened that packet and it was a pair, set of underwears?
I think she was embarrassed. Her mother was embarrassed. I was embarrassed. It was just this awkward all round. And then I think we just moved on very quickly to the next present. So it's, just really interesting things like that. And after, I suppose, an accumulation of experiences like that where you realise, I'm getting a hint that that's not the common thing to do.
So going back to when you said that, you finding that you were kind of on the outside of this or that society or that grouping,
Yes.
And that no matter how good you were at studying, that you felt that you were still not part of it.
Yeah.
How did
I'd later discovered that was just my personality.
I was going to say, how did you bridge that, or did you, cross over and realize that maybe it is more than just being studious, and maybe it's not just your personality, but indeed in society that it is about who you know. Yeah. It's not what you know.
This was the constant conflict I had growing up. So at home, my parents were very much about study, and that's all that mattered. And I was in this school environment where I was like, well, no one actually cares what your results are. And even if they are that amazing, what people care about is, how you interact with them, how you leave people feeling, things like being able to help each other out, teamwork. But actually more than that, just having some kind of commonality. So on the one hand, I had all this, I felt I had all this pressure to stand out and be competitive. And on the other hand, that was probably the least valued thing in the environment that I was in. And I went to a Catholic primary school. Most of the kids were Italian. And I still remember feeling a little bit ostracized because I could perform at that level. Like there was this one incident where, my teacher was just asking, does anyone know the origin of the English language? And just because I like reading, I stuck my hand up and said, yeah, it's Latin. And the teacher then turned to all the Italian kids in the room and said, you should be ashamed that someone who isn't even Italian or native English speaking knows this and you don't. And I remember thinking, oh my God, now they have another reason to hate me. I should just shut up and just never show what I know, what I read, what I can do. It then became about hiding as much as possible, every possible bit of evidence that I might not be the same as everybody else. And so I kind of went from being quite, engaged in things to, I know the answer to that, but I'm not going to say it.
So did you chose to then not participate in class, eventually, like slowly, like withdrew and then chose to be more part of the in-group or to be accepted and rather than excel academically?
I was the quiet achiever. I could achieve quietly, but not in an open setting, or it just didn't feel comfortable to do that. So I suppose there were all these different layers of it, being on the outsider in terms of just culturally knowing what was or wasn't appropriate to say or do, knowing what utensils to use, having different toys and food to talk about, to then discovering these the way that what's the appropriate way to respond to authority, but then also discovering how people react when you go a little bit too far from where I suppose the bulk of the population is, especially whenever someone else uses it to make others feel inadequate. Then you become this involuntary part of someone else's point that they're trying to make, when the last thing you want to do is ostracize yourself, and all you want to do as a kid is belong. But then as I got older, I had the reverse side of that as well, because my father wanted me to go to Vietnamese school. And by that point in time, having grown up with strict parents, the only vocabulary I knew was, yes, Dad, yes, Mum. And those were the only 3 words I really needed to learn growing up. So it wasn't, conversational Vietnamese, if you like. And so as I got older, they sent me to Vietnamese school, and I remember being 11, but being put in a class for 6 and 7-year-olds, because that was the level of my vocabulary at that time. And so here I was now, an overly anglicised Vietnamese in a Vietnamese school with other people's kids who'd more recently come to the country. And again, I felt on the outside of that. I could barely say my name correctly in Vietnamese, and I still struggle to say it now. I think I sometimes describe it as I speak Vietnamese like the Scottish speak English. It's completely valid, but for a lot of people, it's difficult to understand. So here I was on the edges of Australian society and also on the edges of Vietnamese society, and I felt like a fake Australian and a fake Vietnamese person. So it was really
an
odd,
interesting kind of I suppose I can similarly describe same thing for me, kind of straddling between the east. I call it straddling between the east and the west. Being brought up like you in a very kind of traditional Vietnamese household, and you want to be kind of integrated and be part of the wider society, and with your friends who are mainly Italians or English speaking. So both. But how do you see, in terms of then later on in life, as you move into the workforce, and when you moved out of Perth, say into, moving over here to the East Coast, did any of your experiences growing up in Perth, do you think that carried on with you to when you moved to Sydney and then into the workplace?
Quite a few, not in the way that I thought it would. I had the privilege of going to a public high school that was extremely multicultural. And one of the things that I actually loved best about going to that high school is I went from this environment which was primarily Italian kids, and there were maybe only 2 or 3 Asian kids in my school, and most of those were my brothers and sisters. So there were a few others, to this amazing high school where you had Greeks and Italians and Caucasian kids, and you had a diversity of Asians. It was the first time I saw a diversity of Asians, and that just blew my mind. It's like, oh, it's not just Vietnamese. You've got Chinese, and you've got Japanese kids, and Malaysian kids, and Singaporean kids. And it was just so beautiful. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I felt more like I belonged, and it didn't feel like I was so much on the outside, that everyone almost had their little groups. But because everyone had a place of some sort, it was a very different kind of experience. And I think actually just being a part of that school and having engaged with so many kids from so many cultural backgrounds, but also religious backgrounds. It's the first place I discovered that there's this thing called Buddhism as distinct from Catholicism, as well as atheists and Greek Orthodox kids. So there was that level of diversity, but also, again, going from a Catholic school to a public one, there was also diversity in the kind of jobs that people's parents did. We had everyone from cleaners to doctors and lawyers all in the same school. And so probably the key experience that I took into my professional life, my working years, was just the discovery of, the possibility that there are all these different experiences that people would have had leading up to where they are in their careers or their roles, and always just being mindful of, what you see and interact with on the surface is always just the tiniest slither of a much bigger story, in many cases which goes on for generations. So I learned to firstly stop behaving as if I was on the outside.
How did you do that? How did you stop behaving like as if you're on the outside?
So I think one of the first things I learned was to, it was a really little thing. I used to wait for someone to talk to me, for example. It was like having permission or waiting to be noticed before someone would, engage with you. And I think by the time I started my career, you kind of had to shut me up because I knew what it was like being on the receiving end. I'd make an effort to look for, who's the person who feels the least comfortable here, and how do I make them feel welcome, even if I don't feel particularly welcome myself. How do I take the attention of myself and at least create that for someone else. And strangely enough, if you behave like you were supposed to be there, people treat you as if you are. And the other key thing I learned was to just be curious about differences. So, that's different to how I do it, or I've never seen anyone do that before. What's that all about? And to, ask questions and discover that kind of thing.
How did you get into move into the career that you did as being part of APRA, being in the regulating space? What got you there, or
So when I went to university, I started with a science and engineering degree. And then I found that the human interaction was missing for me, and so then I moved into law and commerce, or law and economics. So by the time I finished, I was on a career path to become a lawyer. And when I took on, one of the reasons why I wanted to get into law was this whole idea of giving people a voice who otherwise wouldn't be able to, do that on their own. And I still remember having to write an essay of some sort for why I should be accepted into law and what I would do with that law degree if I could. And I even remember in my law application, I wrote that there's so much that people don't truly understand around the cultural incentives and drivers and nuances behind why people do the things they do or react the way that they do. Not to say that it excuses behaviour, but it provides a different context for a conversation that enables someone in the legal profession to be able to better help someone in a situation, just understanding their cultural context. So I wrote a much less eloquent version of that in my application into law school. So by the time I finished, I wanted to do something that was a bit white knightish, protect those who can't protect themselves, or to play a role which was around safeguarding and protecting.
Protecting the underdog.
Yeah, that's right. Or people who should have the right to go about life assuming that certain things are taken care of, which is why the role with APRA was perfect, because the whole purpose was to make sure that people don't lose their money. And there were all these laws and regulations around it, and our role was about ensuring that these institutions who were given the right to take people's money in certain circumstances, whether they were insurance companies or friendly societies or credit unions or banks, that they dealt with people's money with the appropriate level of responsibility and understood that this is other people's money that they were dealing with. So I loved the idea of working for the government, protecting people's rights, making sure that people entrusted with our money did the right thing. And it was also at a time when superannuation had just become compulsory. So I remember thinking, gosh, if I have no say in how much of my money gets put aside, I really like the idea of working somewhere that sets the frameworks and guidelines around how that money is looked after, because these people don't have a choice. So it's another version of giving a voice to the masses on matters that are probably really complex, that people shouldn't have to understand in that level of detail to know that they're safe. So sorry, that's the long-winded version of saying this is how I
and did you find it fulfilling? Like, is that what that's what you wanted to do, to protect people and ensuring that those institutions are guarding these people's finance.
I absolutely loved that protection role, but I also loved the law reform side of it. So as I was coming on board, it was when financial services reform was happening in Australia. So there were these new bills and acts that were coming through, and part of the role involved looking at, what's the impact of these changes on consumers, on organisations, on shareholders, and looking at things at that macro context and considering, if we change the laws in this way or that, what would it mean for everyone? Who would gain? Who would lose? Being in a position where you are doing the business case for the introduction of a new law, it's both daunting but also very rewarding to be looking at so many interests and trying to find a way to make it right and make it implementable. So it kind of both allowed me to use my law degree and being able to say, what the current legal position is, but also the part of me that's always been interested in, saving the world, changing things, but using the law and regulation as an instrument for that, but being pragmatic about the whole thing. So I was both in a position to shape and contribute to the future, but also to ensure that past laws and what they were intended for were still, achieving that purpose. So it was, it was spoiled really as far as.
So it was for an organisation like APRA, which is one of the major institutions in Australia. You have found that your voice and your ideas, that you were able to influence the organisation as some of these changes came through.
I got an opportunity to be a part of it. I had the opportunity to look at draft legislation and consider, what does this mean in reality for different stakeholders. I had the opportunity to be at industry consultations where you would hear from different stakeholders what the cost of regulation is for them. I had the opportunity to look at bits of the law that no one else had or did or had as a task or job to do and look for what could go wrong. So they were all, really fulfilling experiences to be a part of, especially when you're just a graduate, and you have absolutely no life experience, and all you know is the law and to ask questions when you don't know.
And so going in there as a graduate, from the sound of it, what other opportunities were presented to you? And if we can go back and touch upon your feeling, your experiences of being on kind of on the edge, on the outer, within your community. Obviously, by the time you were a graduate and you were in entering the workforce, did that feeling was still with you, or did you make more effort to be part of the system, and therefore would you describe it as a successful integration, if I can call it that?
I'd say I still struggled with it a fair bit that first year. It was in my graduate year, we had graduates from we had a fair bit of diversity in our graduate group actually, but then we were all split up into different parts of the organisation, and I still found myself feeling somewhat on the outside of it all. I couldn't say though whether that was specifically cultural or just being young and new. And I was certainly less assertive than I am now in terms of sharing my views. That could have just been a matter of inexperience. But what I was definitely lacking at that time was any kind of guidance or mentorship from someone who'd gone through that path. And I actually remember, walking into work, and the things that I noticed were actually where the Asians were, and how few of them there were, and how integrated they were, funnily enough. And it was quite interesting because around me there were a number of much more senior people who were quite they spoke as I did. They seemed quite integrated, and there were also some who were technically brilliant but perhaps still had quite an accent in how they spoke English. So there was quite a range there as well. And it's only now that you ask the question I think back and go, well, those are probably actually the first things I noticed. Where are the people who are closest to my experience? But even then I was still too scared or unsure or awkward to actually approach them and ask for mentoring or guidance, because culturally that's not how I was raised. It was always you wait for someone to come to you, you wait for permission. It's kind of rude to go up to someone and ask. And I only know now, many years later, that the opportunities that I might have missed, just knowing that you can actually ask for things. So I think one of the biggest cultural habits I had to unlearn was the waiting for someone else to save me, rescue me, notice me. The whole strategy I had been brought up to believe in was that you do your work, you do it really well, wait for someone to notice, and that's how you would climb. And I spent the longest time just doing really great work and going nowhere and wondering what on earth is going on.
Do you think that's a cultural thing within the Asian culture? Do you think?
I don't know whether it's an Asian thing, a Vietnamese thing, or just my dad thing. But I certainly had the impression that having an alternative point of view or speaking up when you had a different idea was just a bad idea altogether, and that the only things that were really valued were obedience, compliance, doing the good work. The philosophy was that the work would speak for itself, under the assumption that workplaces were areas where you had benevolent managers who were coaches who looked out for talent, not people who were under-resourced, had multiple requirements on them, and people development was one of many, many things that they had to do. So I had been led to believe that workplaces were, that there were just people sitting around with nothing else better to do except notice where the talent was. And, I found out very quickly that that just wasn't the case. Not as quickly as I'd like, but that just wasn't the case. And I think part of that is with, I think the environment that my parents grew up in, that may well have been how it worked in 60s, 70s Vietnam, and how just how organisations and businesses ran there. And we're talking, mainly family-run businesses where it was personal and people did have that long-term view of things, as opposed to a government organisation or an institution where it just operates, very differently. The whole idea of building relationships in Australia is very different to the way that relationships are perhaps built in Vietnam, where it was all about deferring to people and giving other people status and showing respect. That was how relationships were formed in business, and it was a very different world over here.
And so after that first year, after your 12 months of being a graduate employee, obviously you continued on within APRA. What was then the progress of your career within APRA, and how how did you get to where you are now from APRA?
Sure. So I had the benefit of doing a number of different roles within APRA. So I started looking at superannuation reform, and then I was in the legal team for a while. And I had the opportunity to do things such as look at international privacy legislation. And through that whole experience, I got to understand government and public service and the legislative process really well. But what I wanted to do to complement that experience was actually get my teeth cut in the private sector. And I had this belief at the time that, in government, you have constraints around what you can do and how quickly you can move. And I wanted to see how much faster you can go in terms of getting things done when you're in the private sector. I had this idea that the private sector would be more efficient, more productive, and I wanted a taste of that and understand what that was like. So when the opportunity came up to take on a public policy role with a mobile telco, I thought, this is fantastic. I can use the skills I already have in terms of engaging with government, understanding stakeholders, but then I'd be lobbying for pretty much at that time, it felt like what a tech company was meant to be. So I got the dynamism, my first foray into technology really, but also as part of a global organisation. So I spent a fair bit of time in public policy and government affairs for Vodafone, and that was an amazing experience in and of itself. It almost blew the whole diversity thing out the window, because we were one little operating company as part of a broader global organisation who only knew one way of working, and that was global. And it kind of was the complete opposite of working in an organisation that was specifically focused on the Australian environment. So, I'd be on conference calls and there'd be people there from the US and the UK and other parts of the world, and we were talking about things like, how different governments around the world are dealing with the very same issues as far as the mobile telco industry was concerned. So to be exposed to that diversity of jurisdiction, the diversity of law, it was just amazingly eye-opening for me working in that context. And after a few years there, I went on to then expand that experience working at Optus, where I went from looking at consumer-specific issues to B2B regulatory issues, and then I got into wholesale regulation, and then strategy, and then again, one of the benefits of working in a large organisation is then you can easily move through different roles. So I think over a few years at Optus, I got to do public policy, and then regulatory strategy, and then corporate strategy, and then doing things like business plans, and then preparing massive bids for large corporate clients who happened to be big banks at that time. to go into sales, managing remote contact center teams, designing new products, dealing with things like, how do you create an iPhone plan when there is no supply of iPhones for weeks? I got to do so many different things. And where I finished up at Optus, it was in the world of organizational transformation. How do you turn an entire organization around from the inside out? And that required looking at customer experience transformation, technology transformation, digital transformation, customer service transformation. The whole organization was wanting to change so many things at the same time. That then led to other roles on transformation teams in other organizations. And where I went to next was Serco, which is a facilities and services management organisation that's probably more better known for the facilities it runs for prisons, immigration detention centres.
Detention centres.
Is it bicycle sharing facilities in the UK? They also run rehabilitation programs and programs and maintenance for the Defence Force. So it was quite diverse, the different activities they performed again. And that again provided me with another view on this whole thing. I remember at the time people were saying, do you really want to work for the organisation that's running these detention centres? And I wanted to, form my own view and just what I learned about the complexity of managing threat to life, threat to mental health, threat of, crimes and participating in how do you separate people who end up in detention for different reasons with different risk profiles, some who are a genuine threat and others who are not, in facilities where there is an SLA for every little thing that someone can or cannot do in terms of how they interact with
SLA is
a service level agreement. There are very prescribed rules on what can or can't happen. And I still remember, going into Villawood and being just blown away that the kitchen staff were, they were in the middle of preparing for a key religious event. I think it may have been Ramadan, and they were educating all of us on what they do with their cultural calendar so that everyone in detention still got to feel like there was a piece of home there for them. So they'd learn these recipes and how to make them authentically. So it's just a very different experience to what I thought it would be, in the genuine effort and concern that people have around making people feel at home and belonging. And I thought, God, even my school didn't do that. I think they get treated better here than I've had in my previous life. So it's interesting how these different
perspectives that people get about an organisation like Serco, the job that managing detention centres, and you being internally working with them, seeing a different. There's a human side to what they do.
Oh, there is such a human side. It's certainly not perfect, but the context is also, part of how those places are run is built into contracts between the government and these organisations, and and there's always a degree to which people have the flexibility to just be more human in how the services are provided. And all I saw was that where they could, they would, and that was how people actually wanted to behave and interact. But having said that, I also came to understand that there were people with specific risk profiles because of their previous criminal activities that had to be treated differently. But I think the misconception I had going in was that all persons in detention had the same
profile,
and they don't. You have families as well as people who have criminal records, and that's part of the challenge that I think both our leaders and also our facilities and service providers have, managing that balance across all of these all of these different needs.
So throughout that, were there obviously any barriers that you experienced or encountered to do what you wanted to do? From what you're describing, obviously everything, there have been more opportunities than challenges.
I think certainly I've been lucky in some ways that I had a really good network of professional colleagues and contacts around me who I could easily express what I was interested in and the kind of difference I wanted to make and the kind of work that I wanted to do. That would always, let me know when, something became available. Because back then I really didn't know what I wanted to do. I kind of knew the kind of impact I wanted to have, but I had no idea how that would look. And neither of my parents were university educated, so they felt limited in the guidance that they could give me. And I think they went as far as introducing me to other people that they knew who were business people. And, I'd spent time with them before I started my career to get guidance on where to go and what the challenges would be. And actually what was interesting is before I took on my first job, I had a meeting with this lovely lady who was the HR director for a large brand, I can't say who, and I asked her for any advice she had to give me for how to approach my career and things like that. And what terrified me actually was that the first story she told me was how she ended up in a situation where she was raped by her boss and how she had to deal with it. I thought it was going to be a conversation about fitting in or how to behave, what business etiquette looked like, given that she was HR. And there were two things that she talked to me about. One was ending up in a hotel room, being...
in what context was she sharing this? That for you to be... In what context was she sharing this? I mean, if you're going
career advice. What to be aware of. And then next thing I know, I'm hearing a story about how she's traveling for work. Her manager, her boss at the time, comes into a hotel room, imposes him on her, and she's feeling powerless to do anything about it except let this whole thing happen, then pick herself up, get dressed, and walk out and never speak to anybody about it again.
Wow.
And so it kind of opened my eyes a little bit to the many different ways that people can feel oppressed or have their voices taken away. It wasn't just about race and culture. There were just so many other experiences there. And the other thing that she said to me was that, which is almost at the opposite spectrum, was to not get overly worried if the roles that I applied for were a no, and that a lot of the time it's about fit, which was the complete contradiction to what my father had brought me up with, which was if you were good enough or if you were one of the best, there'd be no reason they wouldn't hire you. This concept of fit, especially cultural fit, was completely new, and I didn't understand it for a long time. I do now, but those were the two key bits of advice I had back then, just before my career was starting. But coming back to what you were saying about challenges versus opportunities, I think I had been given the idea that if I did X, Y, and Z, careers would be smooth and straightforward. And I've since learned that no matter what you do, there are going to be challenges. And in the same token, opportunities never look the way that you think they're going to look. And it's actually about seeing the opportunities in every situation you find yourself in. One thing I did learn, though, is that there are never any opportunities if you never say that what you're interested in or what you care about. If you never say what that is, it's almost a guaranteed opportunity that will never happen unless you're very lucky to work in a place where someone's key role is to actually create and define those opportunities for you.
So, I mean, for me, obviously the HR story was quite confronting. What did you get out of that, and how did you, obviously, how did that play in your career, your journey in your career? You know, obviously it made you more aware, but the cultural fit part, how did you interpret that, and what that meant for you?
So I realised there's a thing about being a female in the workplace. There's a thing about being an Asian in the workplace. There's a thing about being young and inexperienced in the workplace. And there's also a thing about being bright and having your own opinion and forming your own view and voicing it. I discovered these were all things, and that I needed to just find a way to navigate all of these different areas and find enough grounds of commonality with the people that I was working with, so that those different elements, I had to find a way to make all these differences non-threatening for the people I needed to work with.
How did you do that?
By failing a lot of the time. I can tell you all the people who've said no and rejected me in one way or another. You know, a lot of it is...
But navigating, navigating being a woman, being Asian, you know, having ideas that might be different.
Yeah.
You know, I suppose, how, you know, and many of our, obviously, listeners and those who subscribe to Dawn are of culturally diverse backgrounds, but also particularly also of Asian heritage as well. And they're looking at, you know, how are they going to navigate the system? What do they do if they're, you know, of Asian background or Indian background or whatever? You know, what can you advise them?
That's a really good question. My life is a terrible example of how to do it. So, to be fair, I probably struggled every step of the way. And I was often wondering, you know, what is it that I'm doing or not doing? How do I do this differently? I refuse to believe that that's just the way that the system is and there's nothing else I can do about it. What I have come to discover, though, is as I keep expanding my networks and spending more and more time in groups and communities, whether on LinkedIn or at meetups or just through other professional colleagues, people have similar interests to me in terms of the problems that they like to solve or the problems that they're interested in. As soon as I started engaging more in those areas, I started to discover that there are actually heaps of people out there who care more about making a difference and solving particular problems or exploring particular technologies or looking at what the future looks like more than they care about cultural differences. People who are almost beyond that, where they do not see that as a problem or an issue. And there are also many people out there who feel personally ashamed and embarrassed by the experience of people who have a more diverse background. You know, and I think as I started meeting them and discovering, wow, I had no idea, for example, that there are men who are nervous walking down the street late at night when there is also a female there, because they are worried that they may inadvertently come across as dangerous or make her feel threatened, so they're consciously changing their behaviour to try and make sure that the female feels safe. And it's really encouraging to me to know that there are people out there and that they're almost taking the responsibility and the burden of all the reasons why in the past it may not have felt safe for someone to do that. And I have people saying to me, wow, I am part of an all-male club and I am embarrassed that it's an all-male club, and I've been trying to let females in for the longest time and they're not ready for it, but I'm personally embarrassed that, you know, this still happens and that we work this way. And, you know, have conversation with people where they go back and forth all the time in an intelligent conversation around how do we give people equal opportunity, or should it be about equal impact? You know, what's the right way to do this? So there's definitely a consciousness out there that there's no simple and easy answers, But when you have a common goal of, for example, taking a service and democratizing it to everyone, or you have a common goal for bringing human-centered design into organizations, or you have a common goal for making workplaces better, the more you engage for purpose, the more of a voice or a platform you have. And so whatever your current situation is at work, it's, to see it as temporary, and that there'll be things to learn, and to just keep moving towards, where you really want to make a difference. Because once you find those people and keep interacting with them, doors really open up, and you get to just be human.
I suppose a great example of that would be your tech startup, isn't it? I mean, the whole diversity piece within Xinja. I can't pronounce that thing.
Xinja.
Xinja.
Xinja. Yeah.
Xinja.
Like ninja.
But Xinja. It's quite diverse. The team of there's 14 co-founders.
Much bigger now. So
much bigger. There you go. Because normally co-founders in an organisation is about 1 or 2, really, maybe 3 max. But your tech startup is actually defying the whole, from my perspective anyway. What diversity inclusion is about.
Yeah, it's a very unusual composition on many counts. So if I start with gender, just to get it out of the way, yes. So more than 50% of our executive team is female. The chair of our board is also female. And we have a particular policy or a belief, if you like, that if we don't have roughly 50-50 male-female across our organisation, then we're not hiring the right people, because there's no reason why the best person for the job should be primarily a man or primarily a woman. So that it should say something about the way that we're hiring, and maybe some biases at play if we find ourselves in a situation where there's too much of an imbalance for too long. Time to time it may be there. But there's this general principle that we hire the best people for the job, and given population distribution, it should roughly be 50-50. Now the other areas of diversity is that we have people who have both experience in startups as well as experiences in very mature organisations. We have also functional diversity. We have marketing people, we have data scientists, we have customer service teams, we have hardcore risk and compliance people, and finance people, and customer-centered design people, and we have innovators, and we have hardcore devs. So there's all of these different functional areas of expertise, but also the range of different projects and things that people have worked on is so diverse. Not to mention, people's relationship statuses, everything from not even dating right now to have had, grown adult kids. There's just this diversity of life experience, and it's it's such a nice change to be in that kind of environment where there actually isn't such a thing as a norm, if you like, where here is the core group and they behave like this. There is no such thing at Xinja, because there's so many diverse views, and half the immigrants in the organisation are POMs, so it's a really nice mix, and it's so different to what it's not your typical tech startup, and it's not your typical financial services organisation either. The range of ages in there, it's just I just haven't ever seen anything like it. And sometimes, I get a little bit arrogant. I look at other people's pictures of their teams, and then I look at ours, and some other teams don't have as much diversity as we have, and it's something I'm quite proud of.
But how do you deal with the, obviously the concept of how many founders now do you have?
So we had a number of founders at the beginning. It was over 10. I can't remember the exact number. And then some of them have stayed on to work in the business. they all still hold shares in the business. A number of them have stayed on to continue to work in the business, and since then we've had our teams grow as staff, and other partners have become part of Xinja.
And I don't know how much you can talk about it, but in terms of the whole technology piece of what you trying to do, it is a very obviously new idea. And do you think, a place like Australia is ready for it? Technology, banking, digital banking?
I think in terms of the possibilities for customer experience and the difference it can make to customers' lives, people have been crying out for this for the longest time. And it's partly been driven by their experience a bit in the UK and Europe, where customers do have access to experiences such as real-time transactions, being able to, for example, basic things like set alerts when you've spent more than a certain amount so that you can adjust your spending, being able to get insights on where your money is going, and being able to proactively manage your behavior so that you achieve, certain goals. So it's been available in other parts of the world for quite a while. Right. But what's interesting is that the way that it's become available in other parts of the world is because there have been new entrants into those markets. To some degree, existing players in those industries have taken on bits and pieces of those innovations, but it's been primarily driven because there have been new entrants. So customers have been ready for it for quite some time, and the technology enables that. What I think we are challenged with and trying to work through now in Australia is how do you make the benefit of that technology available to more and more Australians when it hasn't been used here before. And like when you're doing anything for the first time, you have, I'll just call it first time risk, because it's unproven or untested here, which means it comes with, just different sets of risk. And our regulatory framework is different as well. And if the regulations say you can only do this, or you've only met these regulations if you use this particular type of technology, it can limit how quickly Australia can expose customers to technologies available in other parts of the world. So we've got this fine balance to achieve between technology and innovation and relaxing regulations so that they become technology agnostic, but not inadvertently exposing people to the dangers of untested technology that come with, a whole variety of risks. So for example, I've seen Ethereum wallets, their websites now go to great lengths to explain and disclaim, we are not a bank. So whatever cryptocurrencies that you put into our wallets, you are the sole person responsible for managing that. And if anything goes wrong, we don't have a helpline that you can call where you can just validate your ID and we can find your money for you. This is the whole purpose of cryptocurrencies and how they work.
For our listeners, Ethereum is a cryptocurrency. For those who are not into cryptocurrency yet. Yeah.
And so this is exactly what's happening with like anything new. There's risks, there's dangers. Some people may use that technology to defraud, scam, steal, do all sorts of terrible things undetected. And at the same time, the same technology can also enable a whole raft of amazing customer experiences that you just can't get any other way. So this is the challenge. It's, I suppose, same with any parent. Every time there's a new experience available for your kids, you're always balancing how do you enable them to test and try and learn without overly hurting themselves or anybody else in the process. So we are probably not where other countries are in terms of where the regulatory environment enables technology to be implemented or innovated at the pace that we'd like, simply because the UK and other parts of the world have already gone first. But we do have the benefit of everything they've learned through that process, which I hope means that it can be more available to Australians sooner rather than later. The real challenge is whilst the cost of technology has gone down over time, the regulatory barriers here in Australia are still quite high.
Right.
So it's the question of how quickly can we capture, that, what's the word? Yeah, capture the value that's now created in making that technology commercially more available, whilst the regulatory hurdles are so high. But there's a lot of work that's already being done in this space. I'm quite optimistic that we'll strike the right balance. And the reality is, if we don't, we'll just regulate again. We're very good at that.
And you've been a regulator, so you know. I said you've been involved in regulation, so you would know.
Yes, and we can predict for that and create whatever powers and laws are necessary, so that if we do need to act quickly, we can, to minimise the risk and the impact for people. Better to prevent rather than cure. So it's really pleasing to see that the whole approach that's being taken is thought out, it's learned from other regulators, but with a very clear purpose to encourage competition and innovation.
And what are the risks if we don't move down that path of, say, having a digital financial banking system in Australia?
So I think some people would say that there are already digital banks available and you can get online accounts today. And that is absolutely true. The real possibility of, I suppose, digital end-to-end or entirely new experiences is to be able to see where we can go next. So yes, digital is available today, but if you look at the experience itself, it hasn't significantly changed much for quite a long time. There isn't a great deal that's new or particularly different in what these services provide, or the level of service. And so what would be interesting is when you create a world where the premium service is actually a digital one, as opposed to the no-frills service is the digital one. So that's going to be an interesting thing for us to explore. Now, if we continue to, if you like, lag behind the rest of the world, I suppose one of the things that are of personal interest to me is how internationally competitive can Australia as a whole be if we're domestically not all that competitive even here. And there have been a number of occasions where I've seen amazing Australian entrepreneurs who found the current environment locally to be just too difficult, and they've created these ideas and then taken them to other parts of the world and created their startups there. And when you ask them, why don't they then bring it back here now, I suppose the areas where Australia is uncompetitive for startups is the cost of starting up, as in the barriers to entry in terms of how much money you need are relatively high compared to other parts of the world. The other barrier is there's a small pool of startup funding available in Australia compared to other parts of the world. And thirdly, the market here is so small.
Yeah.
In terms of how far you can, even though you can start here with that same money and effort, you could be servicing a larger number of customers elsewhere. So these are the areas where we are uncompetitive, in my view, specifically in the area of banking startups. So it's no wonder that Australia hasn't had a brand new startup bank for the longest time. And I don't mean a branch of a foreign bank, and I don't mean a digital version of an existing bank, but I mean actually something, a startup in the real sense of it's being built from scratch. And any industry that's not generating startups, it's a reflection of the economic structure of that industry, the barriers to entry, how difficult it is to make a case to investors that there's enough in it for someone to enter relative to the costs. And if you look at startup stories in Australia where people have done phenomenally well, it's in tech. It's in areas with much less regulation that are much more scalable to other parts of the world. For example, Canva or if you look at the Atlassian guys, they've done phenomenally well. But then you compare the entry point for those industries and the level of regulation they have to meet to something like banking in Australia, it's like chalk and cheese. But then you compare what it's like trying to do that in Australia to other parts of the world, there's still, a gap again. So there's been very few areas where Australia has been world leading in terms of innovative regulation, for example, and for very good reasons. I just think that it's worth looking at all the different ways that we have created a world where we needed to be safe post-GFC that is now holding us back from our ability to innovate and compete and create jobs and create better experiences for people overall.
Where you are now, did you, and looking where you started from, I think how long have we gone for? An hour?
1.5 hours.
We went for 1.5 hours, really? My God, she didn't feel like it.
Because you're having such a good time.
Oh my God. If there's any questions, ask me, guys. But I was just, because I tell you, we can go on about this whole regulations and, the competitiveness where Australia's tech startup, we can go on. But in terms of, you look back, I think you're a successful, co-founder, a woman, now doing something quite innovative. Did you imagine what you would do when you were young, like that, what you dreamed, what you would do, and what you are doing now? Have that kind of, has there been a journey that kind of, there was a logical journey to it, or there's been different pathways to lead to where you are now, and you never imagined that you can be what you're doing now?
I never wanted to be a banker, ever. The last thing, I actually had a job offer from a bank upon leaving, finishing uni, and actually I had a, I'm just thinking, wow, I had a job offer from a bank, and now I'm working on trying to build one. Now, when I was in school, I wanted to be a teacher. I wanted to show people things that they wouldn't discover themselves, and then I wanted to be a poet, to be able to say things that people couldn't say in normal language, and then I wanted to be a lawyer and represent people and give them a voice on matters, and go in there for and fight for things, and then I wanted to fix government. I wanted to, go into government and, reform the education system or something, and teach kids things that they actually really need to know that schools don't teach them. And then, in my consulting years, I wanted to help organisations change from, from the result of an industrialised era to something that's more creative and purposeful, and where we go next, as opposed to just this large organisation because of the sum of all of our history and legacy. And to now be in a place where, actually what I love about the step out of a full-time role into creating a startup from scratch is the opportunity to actually be all of those things in one shape or another in what we're creating here. So, one of the reasons why I said yes to joining Xinja was because I saw that, there was the possibility that if we do our job right, there are kids who can grow up without ever having to hear their parents fight about money. That, if we build and earn the trust of our customers, when we show them, hey, if you do this and that with your money, you'll actually save money faster, or you'll pay off your home loan faster, which means you can do these other things. That trust can then be put back to the benefit of those customers, and that's like the teaching role, if you just showing people what else is possible. But I also liked the cheerleader part of that teaching role, which is cheering people on as they go, recognizing that that's a really thankless job that you're doing there, but we notice and we know it's important for you to do that. So, good on you, keep going. And then, being able to give people a voice. I want to create a service where you can actually just get into the app and talk to someone straight away, like an entire bank branch in an app, as opposed to having to wait in line physically at a branch or wait in line on the phone call, to be able to just go in there and you can talk to your bank straight away. And that's another expression of giving people a voice, where they've otherwise had to sit, wait, suppress themselves, or just decide it's too hard, I'm just not going to do anything about my money. So the part of the opportunity with Xinja is to I suppose find opportunities to do bits and pieces of all those things I've ever wanted to do in my life. So I've given up on a single life purpose, except for one, which is all about, in some ways it comes back to the story of being a refugee. The way I see it, if it actually wasn't for the generosity of Australians at the time who had done what was necessary to create law reform, to have an immigration policy that allowed refugees and immigrants to come in, there are so many opportunities I wouldn't have. And if my parents didn't have the courage that they had, there are so many opportunities I'd never have available to me. So here's the opportunity to give people courage to take steps with their money that they otherwise wouldn't have. And here's the opportunity to show people opportunities with their money that they wouldn't find themselves. So to be in I suppose the common thread through all of these parts of my life and my experience has been creating opportunities and possibilities for people. And the reward is when people get excited by what they can now do that they didn't even know was possible for them when they walked into this situation. And I do hope that that's what we'll be able to achieve with Xinja for every single person who interacts with us.
So when you decided to leave, obviously, your full-time job,
yeah,
to jump into doing, being a co-founder of Xinja, obviously, how did you balance that?
Yeah.
I mean, how do you manage that? Because obviously,
so there's probably a few steps in between. So I left my full-time role, and then I became an independent consultant. My first client was my previous employer, and then I broke up with my mortgage, and then I asked myself the question,
what do you mean broke up with your mortgage?
Sold my property.
Sold your
Yes, divorced my mortgage, and then with some of the leftover money through that, I worked out how long can I afford to take a risk for, and I just made sure then that within that time, and that I did as much as I wanted to within that particular time period. So I bought myself some time, and I said,
how much time did you give yourself?
I think it was about 18 months to 2 years if I made absolutely no money whatsoever, and just managed my budget really closely. Of course, if my lifestyle was all over the place, then that was short. And of course, if I was able to generate enough contracts and work for myself over that time, then it bought me a lot more time. But I worked out my worst case scenario for how long I could go if I made no money whatsoever. And then I had conversations with people around me who would be impacted by that to see, could we make this work? Had the best case scenario, worst case scenario conversations, how would we deal with all of these things? And that became pretty much the plan. And then as I started going through this process, I was involved in creating another fintech startup before I worked on Xinja. So I was doing that sort of at the same time as my consulting business until, and then it was a matter of, okay, if Xinja gets fully funded, then I'll do this full time. If not, we'll just keep building out Xinja until we get to that stage. So there's a lot of forward planning for different scenarios, a very realistic look at the sacrifices and the impacts on people around us. And then as those things fell into place, I already knew, I suppose, what I was going to do next. And I also knew what the startup salary was going to be, and just, working through, what kind of lifestyle I was going to have over that period. And, having tough conversations with myself, like, well, you're not really a startup if you're living that kind of lifestyle. You're such a fake startup. And so that I suppose it was a series of steps, but it probably started with letting go of probably one of the biggest and most ingrained Asian ideals, which is being a homeowner. And that was
I think
the
it's
first
just not
thing
Asian,
to
I
go.
think it's an Australian ideal. You
And
have to have
becoming a renter again, you know,
Yeah.
that evil word, renting. And, you know, I realized how much I came to value freedom, flexibility. I figured I can always be a mortgage owner again later down the track if I really wanted to. But I had this, you know, tiny window of opportunity to do something that I've always wanted to do before, you know, I reach a certain age. I just didn't want to get to this certain age. I'm deliberately not revealing the age. Just didn't want to get to that certain age and not have at least given it a shot for a few key things. And I was quite happy to start life all over again at that age. If these things didn't work out, people start life all over again for all sorts of different reasons around that time. So this was no worse than any of them. And that's kind of what led to, I suppose, the freedom to then take something on the minute that you come across something that gives you a lot more energy than it takes out of you. You're a fool if you don't say yes and jump in and give it your best shot.
Fantastic. Oh, that's right. I'm just that's the end, of course. Well, thank you, Van, for a fantastic, very eye-opening kind of conversation, and for you guys out there listening who have been listening to this wonderful discussion with Van. Make sure that you subscribe to our YouTube channel, podcast. And hope to see you at the next conversation.
Could I add one more thing? I've
Sure.
only just thought of it now.
Yeah.
So in the background, I've been thinking, okay, how have I been taking advantage of being an outsider all of this time?
Mm-hmm.
And I realised there's actually no better opportunity for an outsider than to be the new entrant into a very established industry. And I was like, wow, I've had a whole lifetime of being the latest entrant in something that's been there for the longest time before me. And
That's true. Mm.
so it's interesting, before it was how are you going to fit in. Now people are asking how are you going to disrupt this space. And it's actually a very what's the word?
That being an outsider is actually quite a value. It's no longer kind of the being an outsider as being ostracized, but being an outsider means that you actually have something to contribute to the establishment or the established system.
That's exactly what I was trying to say.
Yeah.
And it's so humbling, actually, to go from this thing that I have devalued
Yep.
for most of my professional life is now being the very specific thing that I'm being asked to bring to this situation
You're
and this
just
industry.
actually by you raising it, I just came to realization too that that's the case. That yes, something that we have been told because we look different or we're so different, that
Yep.
suddenly we need to realize that this is what's unique about us. The difference is us. The difference
and
is
it's
you.
now being embraced. To take a part of you that you have criticized, undervalued, tried to hide for a long time or pretend just wasn't there. Well, it was obviously there.
Yeah.
To now finally have to be in a time and a place where you can actually contribute to other people through that.
Yeah.
It's a real privilege to have.
No, it's a revelation. I mean, it's great that you just actually mentioned that, because it's just kind of, I got to see that too, which is something that we at Dawn, we really try to advocate and push for, is that the difference is you. The difference is that whatever difference you've got, the uniqueness about you.
Yep, your own experiences,
That's right.
your view of the world, what you've discovered, not just through where you've grown up, but what you've learned and the people that you've met, all of that has a place to contribute.
Definitely.
Unless you work in IT and are a tech person, in which case just shh, shh, shh.